Plants are everywhere, and at the first glance, their communities may appear stable in both space and time. However, upon closer examination, we can identify various processes influencing their assembly, including dispersal, competition, facilitation, and extinction. Studying and comprehending these processes is important for effective conservation and ecosystem management. To learn more about the processes and outcomes of plant community assembly, we speak to Professor Dr. Margie Mayfield from the University of Melbourne in Australia. Margie possesses a lifelong passion for understanding how plant communities are structured and assembled. Her research bridges theoretical plant community ecology with the impacts of human disturbance, such as land use change, on plant and insect communities.
Plants are around us, and it seems that vegetation is at harmony. It always looks the same to us. Can you tell us what's going on behind the scenes, what we don't see?
Absolutely. So plant communities are incredibly diverse. They're diverse in ways that we see in a sort of an obvious way, in that some plants are trees, some are grasses. But what's obviously happening underground is also very diverse. So we have interactions between plants, we have interactions between plants and other types of organisms. Underground, the plants are interacting with microbes and arthropods and all sorts of insects, as well as fungi. Above ground, they're going to be interacting not just with the other plants in the community, but with all sorts of other animals as well. And that's going to depend, is that, sometimes those are large mammals, sometimes they're small insects. And so when we look at the diversity of plants we see in any given ecosystem, there's so much going on, it's often overwhelming. So it's often hard to actually articulate all the processes that are involved in allowing a community to be the way that it is when we see it.
What processes are involved in determining the assembly and maintenance of plant communities?
So plant communities are assembled through a combination of evolutionary and ecological processes. So one of the first steps we often think about when we think about plant community assembly is what species are around to assemble into a community. And what we've learned through the study of biogeographic processes and the evolution of plants is that there's some sort of pool of species that have come to be in the local region of a given community through either biogeographic processes of dispersal, or they've evolved there to fit those conditions. So when we think about community assembly, that's the first group of plants that we need to think about, is what species are around. And the next process is how do they get to the community? And that's the process of dispersal. So from a regional species pool, and it's important not to think of this as like it's somewhere else and it's moving in. That species pool is all around us, but it can be further afield than just the community you're looking at. So from that species pool, you have individuals dispersing into a community that's assembling. Again, that doesn't mean that there's a blank slate and we're populating it with individual plants that are dispersing in. But you can think about that individuals are dispersing into a plant community all the time, and that's changing what species are around to interact to create a community, to create the diverse plant communities we see in forests and grasslands, etc. Once those species have dispersed in, then a whole suite of other processes are involved in that assembly. So one process we think of as we often refer to as environmental filtering. So that's if you have a seed, say, come into a community, can that species, that seed survive in that environment? So for instance, we can think of a very simple case of, let's say you dropped a tropical tree into a desert. Even though the seed made it there, it's not going to be able to survive because the physical environment is simply inhospitable to a species that has evolved to be in a very wet environment. So that's the first process that we often think about. The second set of processes, it's sort of a group, and that's species-species interactions. So this is where once a plant disperses into a community, it makes it through that filter. So yes, I can live in this environment. Now I need to be able to interact with all these other species and still survive. So that's where things like competition come in. So species compete for resources, they compete for space. But But there are other types of interactions as well. So we have sometimes facilitative interactions, something like a nurse tree effect, where you could have a little seed. Maybe it needs a slightly different environment as a baby plant than it does as an adult plant. But if it happens to land near, say, a log, it might find that it's able to survive in that environment, whereas if it fell and dispersed into an open environment, it could not. So sometimes you get these facilitative interactions where one plant actually helps another one survive in that environment. So we have that competition for resources that's going to sort of make it more difficult for things to survive in the communities. We have facilitative interactions, and these are just the interactions happening between plants. We also then have all sorts of interactions happening across trophic levels. So what that means is we have interactions with herbivores, so animals that are going to eat the plant, and that's going to determine how well those plants can interact with the other plants. We have positive interactions between trophic levels, so things like pollination or mycorrhizal interactions in which you have an organism from a different taxonomic group, like an animal or a fungi, that provides some sort of interaction. In those examples, those are both positive interactions. So pollinators help a plant reproduce, mycorrhizae helps the plant get resources, and both of those things indirectly affect the way that the plants are going to interact with their neighboring plants. And so you can see that there is this layer upon layer of interactions, starting all the way down at the evolutionary process that determines whether that plant can survive in the environment at all, and going all the way up to multi-trophic level interactions that lead to indirect webs of interactions around a whole community.
So in a sense, the communities we see in every given spot are kind of very unique and very specifically adapted to this point. So in which way can we make use of this knowledge in maximizing conservation outcomes for these plant communities?
So from, conserving or protecting and sometimes restoring plant communities needs to incorporate all that information about how plants got there, how they assembled, and how they interact. And the reason for that is if you just try to sort of change the species that are found in a given place, and you don't pay any attention to how they're interacting with each other, the chances that they're going to be able to persist or the right species are going to persist in a given location are really unlikely. So let me give a couple of scenarios that I think will help. So one, we can just think about biodiversity preservation. So we're often confronted with species living in little remnants of vegetation, and we have decided that this vegetation is something we really want to protect. We want to protect it the way that it is in its natural state. But if we have a situation where that remnant is very isolated, then we have concerns about whether or not there is a source from that species pool that's going to be able to keep bringing new dispersal into that community. And that's very important, as we talked about before, in that assembly process. So yes, species reproduce where they are in their community, but you also need to get genetic information and sometimes new species coming in order to maintain that sort of equilibrium or that stable condition that you want. So a common issue in conservation is that dispersal gets cut off because of isolation of remnants from other sources of plants. Another good example of how these processes can help us with our conservation efforts is restoration. So if we have a circumstance in which a plant community has been heavily degraded, it's usually then composed of species that we don't really want there. So how do you get rid of them? Well, you can manually get rid of them, but that's a lot of work. You can spray a lot of chemicals and try to kill them. That's a lot of work. And often they'll just come right back. And the reason for that is because those species have actually changed the environment in such a way that the stable condition is a condition that we no longer want. So if you want to take it from, say, a degraded agricultural site and return it to a beautiful forest, you need to think about all the processes that are involved in maintaining a forest and the assembly of that forest. So we need to degrade the processes that are keeping the degraded system in a state we don't like, and change the processes so that we can get it to switch over into the state that we want. And that means we need to pay attention to each of those steps of the process. How is the physical environment? Is it suitable to the species we want to live there? Is there connectivity? So do we have sources of dispersal, or do we need to supplement that with seeding or planting of the species that we want? Once we have the species there, how well are they going to be able to compete for resources with the species we don't want to be there, but are doing quite well there at the moment? And do we have all of the partners that they need, the pollinators, the mycorrhizal species, to help them create an environment in which is sustainable for themselves and to create the outcome that we are looking for from a conservation perspective?
So one side is, of course, the conservation for the current time being, but the other is, of course, what is happening in the future with global change and so on.
Yeah.
So what do you think are the most important challenges in plant ecology we need to address in the future?
A big challenge that I think that we really have yet to solve is an understanding of just how all those processes fit together and how the manipulation of one of them is going to ripple through the rest. We conceptually know that they're all connected, but we actually have very limited understanding of what we need to know in order to make a prediction based on a given disturbance. So to me, this is one of the biggest challenges we face. We have a lot of understanding of the abiotic side of things, thinking about how the climate's going to change, where species will be able to fit through that environmental filter. But once you're in that filter, we start to have very limited understanding of how these processes fit together, how, we sort of talked about how there's these ripple effects of this type of interaction is going to affect that interaction and the outcome of the species in general. And it's those sort of connections that we don't fully understand at this point. And so studying those detailed interactions that species are having and how different impacts to the environment are going to alter those processes rather than the outcome of the processes is going to be fundamental to our ability to protect things as the climate changes, and also to sort of take action so that we can prevent some degradation or some loss before it actually happens.
So there's still a lot of things we need to understand in community assembly,
Absolutely.
ecology. So what would your advice for early career researchers then be who are interested in studying community assembly of plants?
So to me, one of the best things that young scientists interested in plant communities could do is really gain some understanding of the theory of how communities assemble and how they work, and to think about plant communities not just as the plants as whole entities, but how do they interact with each other and to create these complex webs of interactions. That involves, in reality, learning a lot of math and thinking about the theory that underlies it rather than just learning what plants are and what their names are, which is often the fun part and what gets us interested in plant communities to begin with. But from my perspective, to make the most impact, it's really that underlying function and process that we need to understand better to protect our plant communities in the future.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much, Margie.